To the cloud. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Angela Gunder, one of your co-hosts for OLC Live and the co-chair of this crazy initiative that we've been digging into fast and furiously throughout the day. I can't believe we've made it around the globe.
Still working our way. Still working our way around.
And I'm here with Clark Shaw Nelson. We have a great segment coming up right now with Amiel. And Tel, you can turn your camera on, by the way. You don't have to. You don't have to hide from us. But before we get started with the actual session, there you are. Hello. Before we get started with the session, I just wanted to go over the format really briefly. And then after that, I'm going to turn it over to Clark. We've had several themes that have emerged that have been so profound and compelling that we probably could have an entire day, week, month, year, just talking about each of these that have come up with the provocations, but more importantly, with the discussions that have happened after each of the provocations from our keynote speakers for the first three sessions that we had. So the way that we've designed this, for those of you that are just joining us now, and I see many faces who have persisted from the start, from early this morning. So kudos to you for staying and continuing to attend all of the sessions. I know for some of you, it was a very early morning to get up. And then for some people, it's a very late night to join us for that. So that's been incredible. But this is not a sit and get type of session. Tel's going to lead us in a provocation, and then we're going to immediately move into a collaborative activity. And what we found is that in each of the past three sessions, we've engaged in both writing into a collaborative Google Doc that we're adding content to. And I'm going to pull up the direct link to his section of the Google Doc. So you can jump right down there, and I'm popping that in the chat right now. So you're invited to join us on this document, join us in the South America section of the document. And it's meant to be the beginning of a deeper conversation that we'd like to have around openness within your own context. So we've left a series of questions that we would like for you to answer. I may add or amend some of those questions based on the provocation and some of the ideas that are generated, and you're more than welcome to do the same. This is completely open. And the most important thing I would say is that under the contributors area, please definitely add your name and your contact information, because all of the content within this document will be synthesized in a white paper. And we would like to attribute you as an author and contributor of this white paper as part of this. So that's pretty much it for housekeeping. I'll guide us along the way as we go, but I am going to turn it over to Clark to talk a little bit about the themes from the previous three sessions, and then he will turn it over to Tel, who will lead us in our discussion and our generative ideation that will occur after that.
Yeah, so this journey began early this morning for us, and for others late in the evening over in Japan. And we've been traveling around the world looking at different contexts and different layers of ideas surrounding the idea of openness. But we've heard a little bit about open and local contexts. For example, we've heard about awareness versus adoption and the differences in the amount. For example, in Japan, the finding was that there was a high amount of awareness around openness, around 50%, but only a 10% level of adoption. So much more awareness than adoption. And a hesitation to share for fear of not being good enough in terms of putting your stuff out there. In Africa, we learned about sustainable development goals and sort of wrapping that around openness and giving it a real context for all of the different ways to maintain sustainability as a principle underlying openness, about equity and listening to the person who's farthest from justice, and equitable hospitality. We also moved over to Europe and learned a little bit about communities of open and about the student voice and the importance of bringing students into the dialogue and the conversation, and listening to that student voice, as well as policy, and how you can change the needle and move towards more policies that, for example, mandate openness when there's public funding supporting and and funding projects. So now we fly down toward the South American perspective with Amiel, who's going to speak with us as the UNESCO Chair of Distance Education and a professor of social from the School of Education in Brazil.
Right. Good afternoon to you guys. I'm only a couple hours ahead, so nice to be here. So I got 5 minutes for a small provocation, but hearing what you just said about the other countries, I'll take that as a way to start the discussion. For us in Brazil, we've been quite well known in working with open policy, and a few other countries in the world also in our region have also sort of gotten noted for that. But we have a lot of concerns and a lot of problems with working on open beyond what is our area of interest, which is OER, because we've had a discussion for about maybe say 10 or 15 years in this idea of how OER might lead to a new process of colonialization, right? Of how we might continue to siphon in resources from other places, because one of the ambiguities of OER is that it can serve two masters very easily. It can serve the idea of equity and social justice, but it can also serve to kind of reinforce existing actors within existing players within the system. And so we're very much aware of how these two things are always battling each other out, especially as different governments with different perspectives might use the rhetoric of open, and that in open access, open government, and open data in a way to serve whatever needs they or whatever goals they have. So one of the things that we've been really quite interested in is this idea of localization and contextualization, and how do we deal when we're designing things so that they are appropriate for people that are from different places and different locations. And this initial idea of OERs as being something that could travel nicely, right? That you could just receive somebody else and you can play with it and try to make it something that's available and interesting to you and fits to your context. And one of the I think the provocation that and the thing that I'm really interested in thinking about with you guys is this idea that we've been playing around with designing for the unknown learner, which is kind of a challenge to the concept of just general instructional design. Is one of our first steps is well, you figure out what context you're going to design for. You think about the people that you're going to be in front of you, and you try to design a resource that's quite appropriate for that context. And this obviously has incredible limitations, right? We especially when we're talking about, even if we're talking about specific contexts, there's always a gap between what your assumptions are and what your analysis did and what these people actually are. That's always been a problem, but it becomes exponentially more problematic and interesting, I think, when you start thinking about designing for something that's going to be thrown out there, right? So the real cool thing about OER is that it allows you to think about the design process as something that starts somewhere, but it potentially could never finish. Right. So if you design something that's open in the sense of formats and licenses, at least, what you're basically saying is that you have done well enough, or you've tried to do something well enough, but you really don't know where it's going to travel and what audiences it's going to reach. And if you are designing for OER, you must be designing in a way that's radically different from traditional design, right? So if you just design something and say, I'm going to make it available for, say, kids in an urban setting in, I don't know, Southwest California, whatever it may be. And you design it for that audience, and then you put it online, you're making one sort of design. But when you're designing for an unknown audience, you're doing something different, which we don't quite know what it is yet, which is, how do I design something that once I put it up, I'm designing for potentially hundreds and thousands of different audiences. Somebody else might remix it and do something else with it. So the obvious contribution of OER, I think, is that by using open licenses and open formats, what you're doing is you're making that technically possible and legally possible. But what it doesn't answer really well, and I think we haven't figured out yet, and it would be fun to have this kind of brainstorming around it, and we're trying to discuss within this issue of localization and contextualization, is how do you make the design process actually a design for an unknown audience? How do you make design so that you're thinking about potentially hundreds and thousands of different people in different groups and different contexts? And that's, I think, a really interesting thing to think about.
I'm like typing fast and furiously because I want to open up this provocation to folks, and I think that that should be absolutely the place that we start. And I will let folks know. Oh, anonymous armadillo. Yeah, go ahead. You can play with the bullets. And Steve is just, plus oneing your question. So it was interesting when you talked about, designing for this unknown audience, designing for a group of people that will have the ability to take what you produce and carry it and adapt it and change it for their context. That there's this notion that you don't have this moment of completion, right? Like there's no finality in that creative act like we typically think of as humans. And one thing that folks that know me hear me say all the time is that perfection and completion are illusions. I think that we think of this sort of binary of incomplete and complete, and binaries don't really exist. We have this spectrum of work that we sort of come in different areas. So how does that change our conversation around openness? Is this perhaps us once again as humans trying to put this construct that's artificial onto something that is a world that should be nebulous and undefined? But to your point, we as designers that create things for humans that they actually need to use and need, how do we have frameworks and structures to make sure that we're not just, building for the sake of building, and that we're actually building with purpose for people that will use the materials that we're creating. So I would, there's a question in there that I'm turning back over to you. And it's just this notion of, if we do believe in this world where folks are going to adapt and remix and change things, how can we actually be productive contributors? Are there tools or frameworks or methods or mindsets that we could use enough to make sure that we're actually moving the needle in the right direction, as opposed to making things that are not really necessarily helpful?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And we've often said that the open movement, and especially within OER, we talk about this reviewing this idea of authorship, and when you have hundreds of contributors or potential contributors, and how much that changes our perspective of ownership. And one of the things that you mentioned in the beginning was this idea, which I think is common around the world, that educators are very much afraid to share their content because it's never really good enough, and they feel like the expectation of what they should be putting out there is so high that if they don't do something absolutely perfect, they won't share because they're afraid that it'll affect how people see them. And I think that as we start to think about design for educational resources that are more open, you sort of have to be comfortable with this idea that what you're creating is incomplete, right? That it is something that maybe it's just good enough. But on the other hand, what that leads to is changing the perspective of those who get resources to say, well, if there's a mistake here, I can fix it. Or if there's something that could be better, I could change it, rather than looking at something and criticizing it for face value and saying, well, this is not appropriate for me, so it must be horrible and I'm going to throw it away. It changes the process of design. It changes the role of the designer. It changes the role of the user, right? Quite a bit. It provides some sort of a sense of agency for everybody through a process that really quite never ends, and there's no closure to it. But if we continue to think about design as something that leads to complete processes and a sense of satisfaction, then we have those concerns of, well, I'm never going to have anything good enough, so I really shouldn't share. So it's a tense situation that I think is open is having us think about this quite a bit, and it's very different from open access and open data, where this sensation can this fulfillment can kind of happen. But in OER, it's really difficult for that to happen.
Yeah, I hear this thread within what you're saying about, open conversation. What does it mean to be able to join the conversation that's already happening, that you have the authority to be a contributor, and that just that locus of control is such a tricky thing of, determining who has the ability to be on stage, and arguably everybody. It's a stage of all. We choose when we want to be in the spotlight or not, as opposed to, I think the structures that we operate within would tell us the opposite. Which kind of leads me to a second question, and I promise I will not continue to hog all of the questions, and folks, you can write in the chat questions too, which I'm happy to amplify. But you've worked within contexts of education within Brazil and then also education within the United States. Are you seeing differences in terms of the approaches to participating in that open conversation or within open design that you could elucidate and highlight for us?
Well, I think the OER movement has seen sort of a bifurcation, and I won't single out one country, but I think that a lot of the rhetoric around OER has been focused a lot on cost and cost effectiveness and access. And I think that's an early and necessary concern, but I think we're sort of seeing a slow grind towards a discussion of things that you mentioned earlier too from other countries, you know, social justice, equity, and how do we bring back the discussion of open back to sort of these roots of what education was supposed to be about, you know, the progressive movement in education. And I think that there has always been a concern for some parts of the world, but I think we're sort of gathering momentum around that again, once that we've established that, you know, of course, there are ways in which OER can make things cheaper and easier for people to access. And so I think this discussion of participation and design, you know, lasting beyond the design is sort of addressing these issues of power, which are normally something that we kind of discount as, you know, this critical outlook as something that we do if we have time. It's kind of coming to the forefront and saying, well, we can't make open work unless these are the central issues we're discussing about. And if we spend less money, that's pretty cool. Or if we use money better, that's even better. We keep the same budget. But these are the concerns that are really important to us, is how do we gain agency in producing resources? How do people that normally don't produce educational resources, which are a very, very concentrated market, how do people from places in the world that normally don't have a voice can say something, right? So one of the things we have in Brazil is we have 5 big publishers, and they pretty much say what kids should learn in school, right? That's the textbooks they get. That's not good. And OER can help address some of those things. I don't know, other countries in the world are very similar. And so I think in the general sense, a big contrast is this change in rhetoric between the two regions. I think that's coming to somewhat of a convergence now.
Very interesting. Jonathan Ports has some really profound thoughts on just your provocation in terms of completion and this idea of no research paper finishes the progress of knowledge, that, you know, it's sort of joining into a conversation that's already occurring and it extends that knowledge beyond that. So if we take that framing of that research methodology, which we understand as academics as being part of maximizing openness, is there room for perhaps open education? He said OER, but I would even expand it to open education to take a similar framework mindset, or even just as you say, the narrative piece, controlling that narrative of openness is about extending that ongoing conversation.
Sorry, I was reading as you were saying.
It's all good.
But I think you make some really great point, and I often mention this as an example. I think that I do it, but of course it's not mine. Of course, you know, science is built that way, right? We talk about standing on the shoulder of giants, but I think that, you know, open network, open research books, I don't know how you say it in English now, the open annotations that you do for science, and the use of open data and sharing of data is sort of trying to do the same thing, is to say, well, let me make this a collaborative process from the get-go. So I don't think we do science in this new design way of designing for for the next unknown. I think what Jonathan is saying is important, because that's what it sort of is. That's like the ethos of it. But that's not really what we do, right? We design by writing a paper that we think is perfect, and we put it out there, we get points for it. But again, I think the rhetoric is shifting now, as we're saying, okay, that's okay, but that's really not, you know, that's not our currency. Our currency is sharing knowledge and building, and so we're not there, but I think it's a good analogy.
Yeah, and that currency is a certain type of knowledge. So especially within science, and I would say even the hard sciences, academics are not rewarded for publishing mistakes or publishing what are called fails. Or failure, when in actuality, all of those fails are data that could be used for other people to branch off and figure out other solutions, or as some people contextualize it, that fail is positive information of where not to waste our time. But we don't, just as you say, the conversations are not aligned. You know, we have a system that rewards us for X, and we sort of participate the best that we can, even though we should be paying attention to why. Yeah, absolutely. So y'all are talking about all my favorite things right now. So I just, I'm super excited about this conversation. I'm going to let Clark ask a question that he's been asking to all of our speakers that I think has been pretty compelling as well.
Yeah, so, you know, there are a lot of levels we're hearing about today, so many different levels and the whole spectrum of where everyone is in terms of openness. A lot of people think about this just OER and then MOOCs and so on. And now we've added on a design layer and even the idea of oppression that can happen as a result. But really, I wanted to think about the policy and sort of law aspects. I believe there's at least one country in South America, if not more, that, if I may be incorrect, but I could have sworn there is one where they actually got like a federal law that says, you know, if you're going to, you know, use federal funds or state funds to fund research, that you would have to publish openly and create open educational resources and share your knowledge, share what you're doing with the world through, you know, Creative Commons and stuff like that. Is that the case?
Yeah, it is. So, you know, Argentina is a good case where research is, open access policy is very advanced. In Brazil, we don't quite have legislation. Colombia has some really good OER policy at a national level. But we've been advancing in different countries in slower paces around this. Open access has always been a very you know, South America has been very advanced in terms of source of open access policies and open access journals. I mean, our major publications in South America are all open access. So it's a very important movement in Brazil as well as open source software, right? So it's Brazil particularly, but Latin America in general has been very strong in that region. Not in terms of OER. I mean, in OER, again, Colombia has a very interesting policy. Brazil has been advancing quite a lot with lots of federal and state policies, you know, but this is not something that's incredibly advanced in other countries.
I'm curious about how they got to that point too. I mean, that's another level or layer to throw in there, is like, how do these countries like Argentina and Colombia and so on move toward having these types of policies and laws? And you know, we just heard from I guess it was England, you know, where there was one of our speakers was helping try to move the needle in terms of get policy moving and these types of things. Yeah, in the UK. So I guess the question also is, what are ways that, you know, what are some steps that can be taken and things that can be done toward moving that needle?
So I can give you the example. So I'll pitch this because we're proud of it, because we just got the Open Policy Award from the Open Education Consortium this year. So our Open Policy project, which is kind of cool for us. We often don't get recognized, so when we do, we have to.
Wait, oh wait, hold on. Clark is working on some recognition on our soundboard. Oh, it didn't play.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
We have a sound effects board here, and it's very finicky. Wait, hold on.
That would have been good. Things flying on the screen.
No fun here.
So I think in different countries it's worked differently, but in the case of Colombia, and I know in the case of Brazil, for example, which have advanced quite a bit, it's a very much a grassroots movement. And so what we've done here, and I think other countries have done in some form, is that we've tried to find partnerships in government. Right, so we created in 2017 this Open Education Initiative, which is meant to bring people from civil society and universities and researchers and government together. And we actually had a working group within the Ministry of Education for about a year, where we had meetings and discussed policy. And we found these people that were in government that were really interested in pushing this forward, you know, middle level managers, people that were really passionate about this. And we identified these people, and then they worked with us. And we brought people from civil society that were very loud, and we brought researchers that could do the research. And we sort of gathered to push this and to move it forward. And we managed to do this in different levels of government, say in the Ministry of Education, but also in other ministries and important policy documents to make sure OER and open access were in there, and also working through, you know, creating and passing bills, you know, through the legislative process. You know, so slowly moving those forward, and they take a very long time, but they're also not very useful when they pass, right? If nothing else is done. So having the law is really cute, but people don't change their habits just because there's a big federal law that says they should do OER, open access. You really have to change the culture of the institutions and the places that you're working with. And so that's what we've been doing at every level, is working with creating these working groups where people discuss and they find what is interesting about this and how it benefits them. And then we can make these policies change at institutional levels. And then eventually it becomes easier for a larger thing to happen. It's kind of eating from the inside rather than forcing it to happen from the outside.
Yeah, it's critical in that direction. And it's certainly a theme that I think has come up in every single session that we've had today, just that piece of the cultural work and how integral it is to success if we're truly trying to create an impact. Tel, you asked about ugly OER, which I actually was at that presentation that Nate Angel is referencing, and Jonathan's on the call. Jonathan, do you want to talk a little bit about that concept?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think Tel's provocation is really fascinating and interesting, and this is kind of a side point. He made some sort of passing reference to something. I think of this as expression, don't let the great be the enemy of the good. And I think that when we're making OER, think of OER as always as works in progress. So, I gave a presentation at the Openness conference that was recently in the US about a particular kind of very dynamic OER. I've been calling it jitter, and just-in-time educational resource. And I think that, there's a room for us to, sort of responding to his provocation to sort of think of our works as our OER as always works in progress, and, get it out. Don't wait. That's part of the open movement is, I don't know. I think of one of the things of the open movement is I want to put all my stuff on my webpage, even if I'm embarrassed about it, because it's got to be out there. People have to share it, and great work may come from my lousy first step in one direction and other people's brilliance working on top of that. And so I think it's, I don't know. So I think that we should not, there's a little bit of a tendency to wait until we have really beautiful OER. And people have made some amazing OER that look like professional books and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think we should also be willing to get our stuff out quickly because it can contribute to the community, and Tel's provocation that, that's the nature of this, that even the most beautiful one today will be part of steps towards future learning and towards other people contributing to the conversation, I think is really important. So anyway, that's all I had to contribute.
I'm so excited that you were here to contribute, because in that session, the designer in me, I come from an instructional design background, died a little bit when I read ugly OER, and I was like, why does it have to be exclusive? Like, they're not mutually exclusive. But your sentiment and your framing right now is so perfect, and it reminds me of some work that Adam Kroom at the University of Oklahoma and I are doing around the idea of marrying open principles with design principles and design strategies. And are there tools that we could use that take away all of that effort to make everything beautiful and focus us on the content just as we want to? So they're not necessarily ugly things that we're producing, but we're not waiting until the end of time, until we're all grandpas and grandmas and whatever, in order to produce those things. So thank you for that. For that. Oh, Nate, come on, Nate. You're poking all sorts of bears here. Other questions for Tel, and Nate has dropped in some of Jonathan's resources too within there. I would highly recommend. I think, Jonathan, you made your presentation open to folks, didn't you?
I always do. It's on my website under share.
Yeah, so we'll be able to make sure that you have that resource as well. A question from Ed. We've seen a lot of different methods, laws, policies from around the world today regarding OER. Is there a movement to try to centralize into a common methodology globally, or is that too utopian of a goal to strive for? That's for you, Tel.
Yeah, so I don't think there's a movement to centralize, but what a really interesting publication, and I'll find it and I'll post it here in just a second, just came out this year from the folks at UNESCO with Dominic Orr and some other folks working together to create how to make OER policy, right? So we did our own in Brazil, and it's just in Portuguese. We did a booklet for our public servants to explain how to create OER policy. And I know in the US there are a couple of models that I know of as well. But I think this is the first sort of comprehensive book that really looks at not just some basic steps an institutional level in creating a policy, but talks something like what we did is in terms of technological and didactical, pedagogical, the whole shebang. And it does that by analyzing many different cases from all over the world that have managed to implement some level of OER policy. Oh, well, there it is. And I haven't read the final version. I reviewed the first couple of rounds with Dominic, and I thought it was a fantastic resource. It's great analogies. It talks to everybody in the whole policy making system and how you can engage everybody. I think it's a really great resource to think about OER policy, and it looks from a very global perspective.
So I missed a question earlier from Steve, and he was talking about meaning and how meaning is so dependent within context. He says in English language, at least, and wants to know, how do we ensure connections between context and content so that meaning endures?
It's a beautiful question, and that's what we've been sort of struggling with for a very long time. A lot of people have worked on how to make OER selectively changeable, right? So being able to change elements of resources and edit elements of resources so that it can become more appropriate to specific contexts. And that's a really kind of a interesting technical challenge and how to make that happen. But it could be as easy as having an absolutely editable document in an open format, right? Having like a open document file makes it absolutely editable. But some people have tried to scaffold that by making specific elements of the resources editable. And I think they're interesting experiments with how to do that, and making culturally appropriate OER, for example. That's very difficult to do, but it's fun. I think that the problem of carrying context is that it doesn't reside within the object, right? It's always a subject-object relationship. So no matter how much you think you've put a context in the object, it really depends on who's going to see it. And some folks from South Africa, once we were talking about this, and they had this discussion about how much do you actually need to contextualize, right? Shouldn't you allow people to learn from the original context and discuss that instead of trying to localize, which they saw as a very pedantic form of adaptation of resources. Like, people don't need that. They can see context and learn from the original context. So there are many layers to thinking about how context could be useful or be detrimental. What I think is really great about OER is that you don't need to pick and choose in principle, right? You should be able to have many different resources with various contexts, very different contexts, and learn from them in different ways, or have somebody you select those to bring to you, if they're a teacher or some other mediator, that can help you have this gamma of opportunities rather than one single way of doing things that can't be edited, can't be modified. It makes it like a unique one narrative that comes from a very specific perspective. So that could be pretty exciting to do.
That is excellent, and it's the perfect segue to having Nate lead us in our annotation exercise that we're going to do to sort of close this out, because open annotation and that process of us, stacking those layers allows us to imbue those individual contexts into that larger piece, and then we're collaboratively making meaning as opposed to thinking that we can do that alone in isolation. So this was so incredible. What a powerhouse of provocation. I certainly have a ton of ideas that I want to enact, and a whole lot of questions for you and the many other speakers that we've had today, based on your sparking these ideas around Remix. So I just want to thank you for joining us today. I know that you're leaving us to do the real reason that we're all here, which is to teach students. So we want to make sure that you are there in time for class. But we'll turn it over to Nate. He's going to talk a little bit about next steps in terms of acting upon the resources that you shared with us. And we'll leave this document open to continue with questions, with provocations of your own. And then everybody, please make sure that you do, if you've contributed, or even if you've not, if you've just listened and sort of helped along the way in the chat, add your name as a co-author on the Google Doc so that we can add you to the white paper. There is a thriving conversation happening on Twitter that has been incredible. So do leave your Twitter handles either on the Google Doc or in the chat as well, so that we can make sure that you're a part of that conversation too. So thank you so much, Tel. We really appreciate it. And Nate, over to you.
Thanks, guys. I'll follow up on the document later. Cheers.
Take care.
Greetings and thank you for that, Tel. That was great. So just a little short piece here. One thing that we're trying to do as we move through this amazing international online summit that some of us have been at since very early this morning, at least in Portland time, is each provocateur, if you will, like Tel, has added some online resources, recommended readings and resources, which you'll find linked from the Google Doc. And one thing that we've been trying to do is provide links to those resources so that as a community, we can also come back and annotate them using Hypothesis, the open source online collaborative web annotation tool. I was only able to get a link to one of the resources that Tel shared up so far. The PDF for the symposium has some selectability issues. We're trying to optimize it so it can be more effectively annotated. So I'll add a link to that when I get it. But there is a link to his article on identifying barriers to the remix translated open educational resources there. And if you don't already have a Hypothesis account, they're free. I put a link in the chat to make it possible for you to go create an account yourself. And if you want, equip your browser so that you can annotate all sorts of different web documents sort of at will. But the links that are embedded in the Google Doc will lead you right to an annotated, a version of the document with annotation already lit up on it so that you can just start annotating or reading annotations if they're already there so far. And as soon as I can, I will add a link to the other resource that Tel shared. I'll be around in this room all day if anybody has any questions, and my contact information is in the doc. If anybody would like to get some extra help with annotation on the flip side. And we've also talked about trying to organize some sort of collaborative annotated-a-thon activity where we will really just take all the documents from the International Summit here and annotate them together as a community. And so we may manage to do that going forward, but if not, you have them all linked from the document itself.
Thank you so much, Nate, for that. And a profound thank you to everybody who's participating in this, whether you're joining us for the first time for this session in South America, or you are tracking us across the globe throughout the day. We have our next session coming up with Robin DeRosa and Terry Green. That one starts at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. So we've got a little less than an hour on the clock. We're gonna step away for a little bit. I think Nate's been hanging out as folks have had questions and things like that. But just know that you have not missed anything if you're joining in for the first time now. All of the slides, the materials, the talks, the sound effects on the sound effects board, everything is open as in the spirit of what we're doing. So we'll make sure oh, hard to put some elevator music on the soundboard. That was fun. But we're gonna go on break now. So our thanks to you, and we'll see you in about an hour. Take care.